Welcome to today's Digital Manufacturing Virtual Workshop. We're excited to have you all join us for today with some great presenters about this topic. We're going to begin today with Trilion's President, John Tyson. We'll be giving a presentation on the Aramis Optical Strain Gauge system. We'll then be moving on to some of its applications with our partners at NIAR. Then moving on to Composite Digital Manufacturing with Digital Twin presentation. And finally, finishing with a demonstration of the technology. Throughout the course of the virtual workshop, please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A session, and we'll be sure to answer them at specific iterations throughout the workshop. So with that, I'll pass things off to John. John, will you go ahead and begin sharing your screen to present?
So we're basically I wanted to start out and give a presentation on the Aramis Optical Strain measurement capability and how this brings Industry 4.0 capabilities to test, structural testing, manufacturing capabilities. And we're pleased to be doing this with NIAR, who happens to be our first customer in this technology field back in 2000. So they've been a great user of the technology for a very long time. So Trilion consists of offices around the United States, covering with offices in Philadelphia and East Coast, Detroit covering the Midwest, and offices in Seattle and LA covering the West Coast. So we're trying to meet the requirements of our customers in a really close and direct way. Our customers range broadly in aerospace, automotive, consumer goods, as well as the various suppliers of all those industries, including biomechanics and microelectronics. But basically, a good portion of the major companies all utilize our technology in one form or another. The technologies I want to talk about is our Aramis technology, and this is our optical strain measurement capability. And this is a stereo imaging system that uses digital image correlation for strain measurement and dynamic photogrammetry for tracking displacements and vibrations. Our Argus technology is for sheet metal forming, and we're basically responsible for the formability of all the stamping houses of OEMs in the United States: GM, Ford, Chrysler, Honda, Nissan, Toyota. And so basically a critical capability for the automotive manufacturing. TriTop is our photogrammetry tool that's designed to be able to do portable CMM type measurements. It also provides automated stitching for the Aramis and ATOS capabilities, so we can look at large structures and know precisely where we are on the vehicle. And it also can make photogrammetry measurements on its own. Our GOM CT, now coupled with the Zeiss product line, allows us a full range of CT or 3D X-ray equipment to be able to study inside materials and do metrology inside. And the ATOS white light scanning capability allows us to be able to use structured light to measure the shape of components and compare components against CAD. So there's a full range of optical metrology products that are able to help us throughout manufacturing and design and analysis worlds. We also offer all of this as engineering services, so we can be able to provide our customers with the best knowledge and expertise in the industry. We have a good group of people. We're doing engineering services, as well as we spend a lot of time on customer training and outreach to our customers. So the technology utilizes a stereo imaging pair with illumination, and it's just an optical measurement system, but using a stereo imaging capability. And this allows us to be able to compare against single point mechanical gauges that we're traditionally used to using, and be able to apply this to finite element model validation using a full field method. So the full field method allows you to really understand holistically what's going on with your materials and structures in a very powerful way, and very simply just pointing a camera at something and making the measurement instead of all the effort that required to mechanically attaching and wiring up and everything else of mechanical gauges. And our equipment works closely with finite element model, so it's integrated directly to be able to look at direct comparisons, and we'll talk about that today. As well as compared to mechanical gauges, we're like a Class A extensometer, so a very accurate tool for your use. So we use a stereo imaging pair where we can, like our two eyes, see where the field of view is and be able to see how things move within that in three-dimensional space. And we can use a couple different methods. We can put a target dot on structures, and in this specific case, the knee we're using as our 3D reference. And so the points on the prosthetic are all being measured relative to the knee's position. This entire test setup probably took 20 minutes versus days of instrumentation traditionally. Or we can put a pattern on the material, and the pattern allows us then to be able to see full field strain capabilities on materials. In this case, being able to see down to the crystalline level of the material. These Luther's bands are specific to this specific piece of material. But the pattern allows the software to choose targets throughout the pattern and create a complete full field response, like a finite element model, but it's really a finite element measurement. So we're using this technology specifically to study complex materials and composites. And because it's non-contact, you just quickly can set up a part and make measurements on it, typically 50 times faster than traditional methods. Full field allows you to not only be able to measure the areas that you know have problems, but it gives you insight into areas that you don't know about. And so typically you put a strain gauge down where you think there's a problem, but here we're measuring full field and can see where you don't know there's a problem. We're measuring true 3D shape, displacements, strains, and accelerations. So it's really the full engineer's toolbox. It gives you all the powerful tools necessary to solve the problems that you're trying to achieve. We're really multi-scale, so we can go from a fraction of a millimeter to hundreds of meters of field of view and be able to provide really wide flexibility in measurement. The fact that it's really material independent, we're just measuring 3D coordinates. So we can be measuring on ceramic composites all the way to thin films or even women's faces, which we do. The idea of being able to measure static right through dynamic testing all the way up to 5 million frames per second are capable with some advanced cameras we have. This really expands the range of capability of measurements, and we're used extensively on vibration and blast type of applications. And the vibration analysis gives you full field, so you can look at the operational deflection shapes, and the fact that it's massless on the component allows you to not only be able to measure everything synchronously, but in a non-affecting way. We use all of this for the finite element model validation and iteration. And so these are the really powerful tools that we're utilizing here. So you can see the applications are quite broad. Everything from material testing to entire structural testing. You see a helicopter there, tooling, high-speed crash. The complexity of today's world is way more than traditional methods can handle, and only a full field method can do things like real shear measurements and this kind of complex understanding of the details of materials. So we're going to look at a lot of different applications that we can be doing in everything from the aerospace composites to broad range of different industries as well as applications. So let's plunge into the aerospace world. In aerospace testing, we're able to do not only displacement measurements, but full field strain measurements. And so this gives you a sense of some of the capabilities that we have. NASA considers this a spin-out technology, mainly from the work that we did on the return to flight of the space shuttle. Here we're working down at NASA Glenn on the validation of the LS models after the Columbia crash in 2004, 2005. And then we were down at Johnson for the full-scale article tests. You can see our cameras looking in at the impact area of the this is a $10 million test with the real leading edge components of the space shuttle. And this data was the actual data used to validate the LS models to get the shuttle flying again. We did it again, getting the space shuttle flying again with the Discovery's last flight. They found external cracks on the tank, and during our test, it fractured, and we showed exactly how to fix the problem. They launched 2 months later, and were able to finish up the space shuttle program with 3 different launches. High-speed HIAD testing down at Ames, the largest wind tunnel in the world. The Orion crash testing at NASA Langley, and a lot of great work at NASA Armstrong. Larry Hudson's done some just really great work with all of that. And Dr. Paul Gradle is one of our top engineers using the equipment, doing hot-fired rocket motor tests at Marshall as well as Stennis. Looking at the return to flight of the space shuttle program, this was the very cool application where Boeing's strain gauge was right where it was supposed to impact. It actually impacted a little bit further back. And without the full field capability of Aramis, it would not have been able to see the real effect on this. The Boeing strain gauge just missed the result. And here's an example of the data that we collected at the time. And this validated the LS models and got the whole space shuttle program flying again in 2005. We do a lot of work since then on jet engines. This is an example of a blade out test where basically every blade out test in the world currently is working with us in doing this. So we do these blade out tests all over the world, as well as full field jet engine monitoring and just overall understanding of the structural response of components in a really holistic way. So you really understand, where the problems are existing and how they can do, where single point sensors just give you a sense of it. Many engineers always say, gosh, with single point sensors, there's always these arguments about what the data means. But now that we're visual and image-based, it's totally intuitive where all the results are happening and what's happening to the part. Here's some examples at NIAR, and we'll hear from Waruna later. But one of our first applications was on the shear panel testing. And this was just really great application that we worked with NIAR on back in literally our first system sale in industry, and lots of other applications. Getting into more bigger applications, we were used on the 787 structural testing. And in this case, they had over 10,000 foil strain gauges on the application. And we were able to, with our 4 sensors looking around the wing root area where they'd had fracture before, we had an additional 200,000 strain gauges. And this helped validate the aircraft for FAA certification. And the idea is being able to reduce the costs of doing structural testing. We're working towards a 50% goal there. The idea that it's 50 times faster to set up than traditional methods. And you're getting hugely more data and really ideally suited for finite element model validation. And here's an example of the wing getting loaded up and with the wiffle tree. It gives you a sense of some of the loading that was going on there. So Boeing was asked a number of years ago by a VP, strain gauges are costing us too much. We're just using way too many of them. Find a better way. And the result report back to him was that Aramis was 10 times cheaper than foil strain gauges, and this is even really much more once you've invested in the equipment. You know, it's really inexpensive. It was a 50 times manpower savings. So instead of spending weeks putting strain gauges on, they could set stuff up in a day and be up and running. And it was 100 to 1 data improvement. I mean, basically, hugely more data and critical for the FEA validation. Another good example was our work on the James Webb Space Telescope, where we replaced LVDTs on the bus structure. And the bus structure was this area down here. And we were able to put 4 systems on 4 sides, 10-foot fields of view, and we matched the high precision LVDTs throughout the field of view. And we saved them $2 million just in the 3-month testing of the structural testing of the bus structure, and that got them back on schedule. So that was a really great application. Another really great application was developing the Aramis thermography for the aft deck of the B-2 bomber, and you can see our equipment up here looking down on the aft deck, and this was developed to do the full-scale ground tests of the B-2, and the data was used to validate the finite element models and validate the repair. And the U.S. Air Force Research Lab thanked Trilion in 2008 for that development. This technology is now used throughout the industries for doing Aramis thermography, and that's where we're utilizing it for correcting the strains for thermal expansion to get the true mechanical strains. We're mapping the three-dimensional the temperature data onto three-dimensional space, so we really know exactly where the data is relative to the CAD model, and we're also using it for non-destructive testing, which we'll talk about. The other thing I wanted to just mention, talk about, is some finite element model validation, and this is obviously a key area for our applications. And the idea here is that when you're looking at a finite element model, everyone agrees that every finite element model is basically wrong. It's just a model. And so Boeing utilizes our equipment to understand the real material properties, reality. So we're measuring the full field response of the material which the model is trying to model. The local variations you see here are real local variations in the material. When you get into real structures, you know, many times the response is substantially different than what the model is seeing. And so in this specific case, we had a strain gauge that was not showing up what it was supposed to be seeing, a high strain concentration, but it was seeing nothing in the real structure. And when it turned out, there was just a tremendous amount of things happening near the strain gauge, but not where it was. So understanding how a finite element model works, you know, in this composite sample here, we're looking at the test and the boundary conditions on how this is going to be working. And when we actually make the measurement, and our measurement here is in red, it's showing substantial difference from the simulation. And let's see why. We can see that the various strains and displacements are just off between the two technologies. So if we adapt the boundary conditions to the real data that we're seeing, we can now see that the new simulation that has been optimized here in pink, that we're matching more exactly the Aramis conditions. And you can see, again, matching the Aramis way better than it had before in all the measurements, displacements and strains. And you can actually go and do an Aramis measurement. The initial simulation shows tremendous variation between the measurement and the simulation. But if we then correct the simulation, now we match much better. So it gives you a sense of the capabilities of being able to look at the overall shape, making sure the component matches the shape of the that's in the model, the CAD shape. We can compare the displacements, which are particularly good for model validation, making sure we're both displacing the same way, and then confirm on the strains. A really good example is this wrench loading up. And as you can see, we have nice strain concentrations on the wrench. And when we look at the simulation is showing seemingly a similar response. But when we look at the difference between the two, we see a high strain concentration right at the nut tip there, and it seems to be caused by a slight boundary variation between the gap opening in the simulation and the gap opening in reality. So we can then correct that validation of the model and for the correct boundary conditions, and now our model is matching much better. So those are the pieces I wanted to cover with you guys, and the equipment is designed to be really broadly usable. All those products I talked about are all utilizing the same software and basic capabilities. And we'll do a little demo just a little bit later. But basically, the things we think about when we're doing these things is what kind of strains and displacements are we expecting, the kind of acquisition speed we want to be able to do, what field of view you want to achieve, the logistics of doing the test, and we then provide application development and training to be able to support these applications. I think now's a good time we can talk about any questions that people have.
Thank you, John. And yes, as we're going through these presentations, feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A section. We'll be answering those periodically. I think at this point, barring any questions that come in, we're prepared to move on to the next portion of our presentation today.
I can throw in a quick change in the presentation where I can just talk about a little bit about vibration measurement until 11:30 for Warunas. So let me step back and just look at vibration analysis, because this is very helpful to some people. This is being able to understand the vibration measurements of components, and the idea is how do we apply this to vibration measurements? And so when we're measuring full field, we can see a component vibrating nicely, and then we can run it into an FFT and see the frequency response of that, and then be able to do a true operational deflection shape of the component. In the automotive industry, being able to understand how a car door slams is everybody cares about that. Does my car door sound all right? But we can do a true understanding of the modal response. Here we are looking at the first peak of the modal response and the third peak of the modal response, and be able to see and really understand, are your stiffeners in the right place? Is this vibrating as expected? This is a good example of a very high-speed application. Here we're seeing a fan spinning, and our data, we're locked in on the hub of the fan to give us rigid body motion correction. This allows us to then track every blade individually. And so now we're able to see the in-plane and out-of-plane vibration modes of the component, and be able to track that throughout the measurement. So this is, a very fast setup. Again, a standard setup might be, 30 minutes or an hour, depending on who's setting it up. There's no wiring or anything else. You just put some target dots on it, and be able to do this in a completely massless vibration measurement capability. And it's all synchronous too. So all of the data is synchronous in your results. So here's a hammer impact on a component, looking at the various modes of deflection, giving you a sense of how you're doing it. Here's an example of comparing to accelerometers. We're looking at an aircraft for ground vibration measurements. Our vibration measurements were very clean. FFTs look good. And we actually matched the accelerometers very precisely. The accelerometers, you can see down here, they had over 50 accelerometers on this. Took 2 weeks to prepare. Our measurement, we were up and running in an hour. Put target dots wherever they had accelerometers, and we matched all of their data exactly. And all our data is in 3D space, and they were all 1D accelerometers. Coffee time. Here's a vibration of a coffee mug getting filled up. Anyway, I think we're now ready for Varuna.